All right, so we are here now, and we're going to
Yes.
be talking about managers in the wacky world of professional wrestling and stables.
Yes.
So, I think a good starting point would be when we first started to see uh, managers, kayfabe managers,
Mhm.
start to become a thing in uh, in wrestling, either on a larger scale or just in smaller territories.
Managers typically have been a part of wrestling since pretty much. I wouldn't say the beginning, but there's always been a managerial type with another wrestler, and that's usually because it was the standard formula in pro wrestling. You always had the manager with the great worker who wasn't really the greatest at talking, but he was fantastic in the ring, or she was fantastic in the ring. So you always had somebody. Or say like we talked last week, or the last time we sorry, the last time we recorded about the fabulous Moolah. She started as a manager for the Elephant Boy. She was Slave Girl Moolah. So back when before she even got into the wrestling business as the fabulous Moolah. So it was just a way to kind of dress up the wrestlers, a little bit. Um, like to rattle off, my furthest memories I can remember seeing on film is the early footage from like the 50s where you had Gorgeous George and you had, Gorgeous George always had either his wife, one of his wives at the time, be the valet and kind of do like the arrogance, the spray bottle kind of perfume or
Yeah,
whatever. Or he would have the valet and he would have the little like butler type assistant that would like issue him like California air and stuff like that, and kind of he was all dressed up with gimmicks. Or Buddy Rogers had a guy named Bobby Davis who was a pretty well known famous manager up in the old Capitol Wrestling. So I mean, but Rogers, but in the case of Bobby Davis, he didn't really need Buddy Rogers didn't really need a manager. You know what I mean? That was just it, that formula kind of reminded me later of like Bobby Heenan and Nick Bockwinkel being together. You know what I
yeah.
mean? For example, where you had Bockwinkel, who is an awesome promo in his own way. I always called him like a dry Ric Flair. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
And then you had Bobby, who is just Bobby, and you put those two together, it was like dynamite. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like
and
Grace,
even
like
well,
Ray Stevens had his own promo style, but I felt like when they put him with Heenan, he was like, like this. But Bockwinkel and Heenan, it was like the sensory explosion.
yeah, and even once Heenan got into the WWF, he was put with some guys. The first one that comes to mind is Kurt Hennig, who
Yeah.
definitely didn't need help on the stick, but not putting them together, you would just miss out on so so much. I think they both helped elevate the other in their roles.
Right, and actually it helped because Kurt, a lot of his bumping style, that over the top bumping that he did, of course it was his own, but he always wanted to be Bobby Heenan as far as the bumping style went because he grew up with that, watching his dad in the AWA because Bobby managed his dad, or wrestled a piece, whenever the manager had to wrestle or whatever,
I
right?
did not know that.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Larry the Axe, he managed him briefly, him and Harley were a team. They were the Pretty Boy, or what was it? That's where Handsome Harley Race comes in, and then there was Pretty Boy Larry Henning, which of course he was clean shaven at the time. I guess that makes him a pretty boy, right? But
Yeah,
we all remember Larry Henning with the big beard and big gruff looking
yeah,
grizzled veteran kind of guy. But yeah, this was early days of AWA, But
yeah.
but yeah, Kurt grew up watching Bobby and Ray Stevens do those crazy bumps because that's what they were known for. So he stole that and kind of incorporated it as his own, but added the Kurt Hennig twist because he was very graceful in the
Yeah,
ring, you know.
yeah. And
So
so managers were functional in helping out with promos. Uh, I think we saw quite a bit of that in the mid to late 80s.
yep,
Um, but couldn't they also be used to kind of elevate the storytelling aspect? Because we're going to get into wrestling stables as well.
yep, yep.
Uh, when when did we start to see? I mean, stables is just tag teams or groups of guys, but when did we start seeing managers put together their own family or corporation?
Um, again, I mean, I can always trace it back to Bobby Heenan. He insisted on calling it the Heenan family, and this was back in the AWA days because, in his words, he described it as he didn't like the word stable because it reminded him of horse stables. You know what I mean? But
Yeah,
family reminded him of the Manson family. Now, it's a lot like when Stone Cold became Stone Cold. His influence was Richard Klinski, the Iceman. You know, like
yeah,
where um, he's like, well, I didn't want to be the Iceman, but I wanted to have that as my influence. Keenan, same way with the Manson family. He was like, these are my family, you know, instead of saying, oh, it's a stable, you know, because
hmm
everyone had stables, but you know, but Heenan was the first one to popularize the whole family thing in the AWA and brought that over with him into the 80s in WWF.
yeah,
Um, now, where it was functional, you ask, is the Freebirds, in my opinion. Freebirds were it started as Terry and Michael, of course, you know, and then Buddy came along. Buddy had, as I said in previous episodes, had been part of the original Hollywood Blondes back in the '60s.
yeah,
So Buddy was a veteran by that time. He was like 20 years in. So, but he was a great bump taker also. Michael was an okay wrestler, fabulous talker, and personality. So
yeah,
in de facto, and he was doing the talking for Terry, and Terry was this big raw bone, great wrestler, you know, in the ring at such a young age. So Michael was pretty much not only his tag team partner, but a de facto manager as well, if you think about it. Just a very overgrown manager because Michael's 6'1" or 6'2" or whatever, and you
yeah,
know weighed 235 pounds. You know, so but that's where in my opinion, that's where I first saw functionality in the manager. Secondly, would probably be the Four Horsemen because JJ had been a moderately successful wrestler years previous and took that knowledge and at first he managed Tully, but then slowly he was managing Arn, he was managing Rick, he was managing Ole slash Barry slash whoever was coming into the fold at the time. But JJ, the thing with JJ was he was a very competent wrestler, much like Bobby Heenan was. Bobby was a non-trained wrestler. JJ was a trained wrestler. Well, maybe they were both similar. Maybe they trained in the job,
yeah,
um, but JJ was a a great hand in the ring, and he had to unlearn that when he became a horseman and wrestle like a manager as opposed to wrestle like a wrestler. It's so
yeah,
it's so hard to master, but he was great at it. Heenan was great at it. You know what I mean? Like, and that's why, and people believed it. They wanted to see those guys get their ass whipped in the ring,
yeah,
like if the wrestler got 5 minutes alone with them or whatever. But
yeah,
Michael was different, whereas he can walk the walk, talk the talk because he was a big dude. You know what I mean? He may not have been the greatest wrestler, but he was, you know, he was tough enough to back himself up because
he
because
he
of his
definitely
stature.
looked the part he was trying to play.
And Michael was young. He was in his early 20s when he went down the world class, doing all that stuff at the Von Erichs. He was in his early 20s because him and Terry got in when they were teens. So they were big dudes, like just as teenagers. Never
Yeah,
mind when they became young adults. You know, so here you go. You got these young adults, And Michael always looked older than what he was. You know what I mean? Like I
Yeah,
thought he was in I thought he was in his 30s in the 80s, and go to find out he was in his early 20s.
yeah.
So
It looks like he was tanned really well. He looked like a purse for a while.
that was most. I mean, Christ, have you seen Flair back in the 80s? I mean,
Yeah,
Tan days or Arn. Uh, Arn looked great. Arn was the one that said fat looks better tanned.
yeah. And he's right. As a very pasty ginger, I can definitely tell you, uh, I would be at least twice as beautiful if I could actually tan.
Yeah, yeah. It sucks that I burn.
Yeah,
I'm with you on that one.
yeah. So the on-screen roles that they would play seemed to always uh, be done really well. You had talked about if someone loses, then they get 5 minutes alone with the manager. Um, was there ever like an on-screen reason to do with the either management or ownership of a territory back then, so that whoever was in that role uh, was able to just kind of go out and tell the story they wanted to. Um, I think of how Vince McMahon was always on commentary.
Yep.
I had no idea he was the owner until right before the Attitude Era. But were there were there ever any more functional aspects like that to where they could be in the ring, uh, be with guys to help form the story that they needed to tell?
Well, you were talking Vince, where Vince, and the reason Vince was the commentator and he didn't let anybody know that he was the owner was Vince was the best one at driving his own story forward, much like how Bischoff was later in the Nitro era. He was the only. It wasn't because he was the greatest commentator in the world, Vince speaking, or Bischoff. Anything could be furthest from the truth. They were great at buzzwords, of course. You know, they weren't Jim Ross as far as like analytical or Gordon Sully or stuff like that, where they can tell stories intelligently but get you in the action. That's a rare art, and that's another story for another time. But
Yeah,
Vince was very good at big picture. This is the outline we want you to follow, and all that stuff. Another guy who was good at that, and actually did have both, was Bill Watts. But unlike Vince, where it was kayfabe that Vince was the owner, everyone knew Bill Watts owned UWF,
yeah,
or Mid South. So that was a little different. But Bill Watts could intelligently, if you go back and watch those old Mid South, because he was great at getting the story across, and all that stuff. Where the managers were used,
yeah. Are there any prominent examples of where uh, leadership of a territory back then was put into the similar role to try to accomplish?
well,
Uh,
the only one, right off the top of my head, the only one I could think of was maybe Jimmy Hart in Memphis, with his ongoing feud with, well, at first he was managing Jerry the King Lawler, of course, because they got hooked up through the music connection where Lawler recorded the album with Jimmy towards the end of the 70s, and they went to the same high school. But when Jimmy got into the business, he managed Lawler at first, and then when Lawler got the injury where he broke his leg playing touch football with his friends, Jimmy Hart goes on television and says, what do you do to a gilded horse? You shoot him, and the fact he literally changes the course of everything, and he becomes a heel manager. And then when Lawler came back for real, he slapped him and broke his jaw for real. So, but Jimmy all of a sudden guided you in a new direction. It wasn't about Jerry Lawler anymore. It was about his first family of guys, his stable of guys that he put together, and then they were getting that in place. So when Lawler came back, of course, one by one by one by one by one, Lawler would work with all these guys in the Memphis territory. So that's an example I can use right off the top of my head. that I know of
Yeah,
that really drove business and stories and all that in Memphis. And Memphis was very story driven. You know,
yeah,
all roads led back to Lawler. You know, of
yeah.
course, he was the top guy, but it was within good reason because Lawler
Were
that was the business model back then. You know,
Oh yeah, and did people uh did people know Jerry's role in the territory and down in Memphis, that that was his business, but he was also uh, the guy. He was the uh, multiple time champion. Were people aware of his role, his actual role in Memphis?
I gotta believe people knew locally. You know what I mean? Much like how Bill Watts was when in Oklahoma. You know what I mean? Like they had to have known him. I mean, they more knew that Jerry was because Jerry had taken himself out of it many years before. You know what I mean? He stepped back, and but Lawler was the top baby face. You know what I mean? I think they had to have known that he was somewhat involved in it. You know what I mean? Or the
Yeah.
fans that didn't know, they believed a little bit more that with that whole thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, it
it's
it does. Was that ever used in kayfabe in a storyline that his role in Memphis was what it was, and then that kind of translated to on TV and in the ring, similar to what happened with Vince in the '90s?
like in the later part. Later part. I mean, like by the early, because they did a storyline actually pre Mr. McMahon where Vince was sending. Well, he was sending WWF guys down to Memphis to kind of
Yeah,
boost business to help out Jerry because Jerry would still had an ownership stake into Memphis, and Vince himself even did heel promos. You can find these on YouTube. He did heel promos
I've seen
against
those.
with he was wearing the the belt, which actually is the AWA belt, but he for all intents and purposes, it was the heavyweight championship of USWA and all
Yeah,
that stuff. And that shit was great in my
yeah,
opinion. Brian Zane, I think, did a video on it that capsulated it pretty awesome as well. But
yep. Wrestling
yeah,
with Regret is where I first learned about that, absolutely, and then I've searched for those promos, and they were hilarious.
I got a compilation tape in the '90s. I remember it was called. It was maybe through RF. I ended up trading it with somebody for it, so I didn't pay for it at the time. Well, it was a trade with somebody else, but I got it was WWF versus the USWA Civil War. It might have been towards the late '90s. I got this tape, but I was like, "Oh, this is Mr. McMahon before it was Mr. McMahon." That's great. I mean, the footage is grainy, of course, because it's
Yeah.
Memphis.
Well,
Um,
and when was that going on?
93 ish. 93. It
Okay.
was right before Lawler. Um, it was like probably like mid 93 going towards summer of 93. Lawler, this was right before Lawler had gotten charged. He got alleged charges put against him there, which
Yeah.
he ended up defeating. And so they did all that business there because Lawler. This was during a time where he wasn't even a year into the WWF, so they were doing like a talent exchange kind of program because Vince by that time all the territories were gone. There was only WCW and Vince.
Yeah.
ECW was just starting up, and you had all these other independent, but it wasn't the ECW we know and love. So it was all these independent promotions that were everywhere. But Vince wanted a solid stable ground for his next wave of talent. So, and actually, WWF used the Memphis system for a lot of years before, as developmental, before even OVW was put in place.
Yeah.
So,
So I know Vince would do that with ECW, going to the very, very early days of
Smoky
Raw,
Mountain,
where there was, huh?
Smoky Mountain also.
Yep.
Yep.
And there was that really weird uh, really weird match on Raw where Jim Cornette showed up with the North American uh, championship from the NWA, and they had uh, Jeff Jarrett in his turquoise outfit. I'm not sure what that was.
The
Uh,
Aztec outfit. Yeah, yeah.
Aztec, yeah. And then he wrestled Barry Windham. Um, that I remember watching that, and I thought it was really cool. But looking back at it now, I'm really unsure what the point of all of that was.
Well, according to Vince Russo, it was a rib on Cornette. You
Oh,
know, depending on, he said it was him and Vince McMahon's rib or on Cornette, which I got to believe more it was a Russo rib on Jim Cornette, not a Vince thing, but I don't know.
yeah,
So I wasn't part of these booking meetings, but um, yeah, it was part of that whole rivalry. But speaking of Cornette, you had the Camp Cornette in the
yeah.
90s, of course, and you had Cornette always had. Actually, he started in Memphis. Year we were both born, '82. He started in Memphis, and he actually started as a Jimmy Hart lackey, believe it or not.
I
So
did not know that.
yeah. He was kind of like the lackey of Jimmy Hart before he was really in, because he was transitioning from being a photographer to being a manager in pro wrestling.
Yeah,
So yeah, and he was kind of a hanger-oner until he didn't become a hanger-oner, and he started managing. I think he managed Sherry Martel when she was down there, and Dutch Mantel were like his uh first two guys. Oh,
yeah.
guy and girl. So
The first members of Camp Cornette.
pretty much, yeah. This was that Midnight Express thing did not happen until he went to Mid South. That was when Bill Dundee got well, Bill Watts came to Memphis and wanted to do a talent exchange with between Memphis and Mid South,
Mm-hmm.
and he ended up getting Bill Dundee as a booker. He ended up getting Cornette and Condrey and the Rock and Roll Express as the trades Bill Watts did. So you imagine that. You had your two top teams, top manager,
Yeah,
with one of your better bookers, because superstar Bill Dundee was a big part of that whole Memphis booking thing too. He was like a third in command from Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler.
yeah,
So much like how Bruce Pritchard was with Vince and Pat. You know what I mean?
yeah.
When Bruce Pritchard was the young boy. So
Way back when.
yep,
Um, so kind of coming up into our childhood times where, mid to late 80s,
yep,
uh, this is where I can remember seeing factions of guys, stables, groups, wherever they are, being put together and having uh, pretty interesting uh, confrontations and rivalries uh, with people. And I always thought it was really cool. And I was a young kid, so I didn't really question it or wouldn't really even know uh, what to question. But um, you see, like the colossal connection.
yep.
You have a manager and a stable that facilitates, this tag team and a lot of other, individuals, but um, a lot of tag team wrestling. What was the first instance, starting off in WWF in the mid to late 80s, to where you see a manager and their stable kind of rising to prominence?
Now, in the '80s, I mean, you go back to the '70s, even. You know, you had your top three managers were Blassie, Captain Lou, and Graham Wizard. And from what Bobby Heenan described in his Hall of Fame speech, they were there forever. They kind of established, and everyone that came through were had those three managers at one point. You know what I mean? That's why Captain Lou had so many goddamn tag teams as his under his wing as far as champions, you know. So, but by the time the early '80s came, like '84 time period, '85 time period, Bobby Heenan comes in, Jimmy Hart comes in. You had these influx of the influx of those two talents right there. All of a sudden, Bobby Heenan brings his Heenan family stables into or yeah, his into the WWF, that concept. Jimmy Hart brings his first family concept into the WWF also, and you just see all of a sudden Jimmy's managing Jim Neidhart, he's managing King Kong Bundy at first. He was managing Adrian Adonis. He was managing the Funk Brothers, So you had Jimmy put with these guys that were very talented, but you also had they couldn't really. Someone could talk a little, but like Jimmy was. Oh, let me tell you something, Dad. Blah, 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 blah. He was the motor mouth manager, whereas you put Heenan with Big John Studd. Big John Studd was kind of just tall, cool, kind of could talk, but not really. But you put Heenan, it's like he can intelligently just
Yeah,
eviscerate you. You know what I mean? And get the point across. Um, then Bobby gets a hold of Bundy. Of course, that adds another layer to Bundy. You had Bobby and Andre,
yeah,
Bobby and who actually it was Bobby and the Islanders at first, if you remember. Then it
I
was
don't.
Bobby and Haku. So, but the Islanders were Tonga Kid, which would later became Tama with Haku. So
Yeah,
um, then you had the established veteran managers. It was weird because it felt like they were being phased out because Blassie was there for a little bit and then eventually faded into the background. Captain Lou ended up finally getting fired in '86 or whatever it was, after the old guard was completely gone, which was a shame. But by the time his run was over, he was put with the British Bulldogs. So that pairing kind of didn't make sense really on paper, but it did at the same time because the Bulldogs were not, they were British and they had their own little thing, but they couldn't really talk. And that's why Captain Lou was put with them. But that was just an odd choice. But who are you going to put with them? I mean,
yeah.
unless you turn heel, right? So
Well,
you had that. But
and I can remember um, that was usually how guys were brought in. There's a stable or a manager, and they go off and they recruit the best of the best from wherever else they come from, and then they're brought in to join a stable or brought in with the manager. That was, I think, at that time anyway, a very prominent thing. That's how I remember so many guys being introduced, that they were brought in from someone.
And it's funny you bring up recruitment because when they brought in Randy Savage in '85, finally to WWF, then they had the recruitment for like who's going to be Macho Man's manager. You know what I mean? And then that's when they did all the segments. Oh, Luscious Johnny D also was a man, but he managed Brutus Beefcake, and he was okay, but he was kind of I always thought he was kind of goofy, to be honest. Like Handsome Jimmy in that tag team with Luscious Johnny, Handsome Jimmy was the much better promo, in my opinion. So, and Handsome Jimmy was a proven draw in Memphis, as we spoke of earlier. But that's a different story for another time. But
Yeah.
um, when they bring in Savage, they have all these managers trying to vie over Savage. Oh, let's not forget Mr. Fuji. Fuji,
Yeah.
yeah, Fuji was not the greatest promo in the world for a manager, but as far as getting heel heat, when he came out, he didn't have to say much anyway because he looked like a Bond villain cross between Charlie Chan, that classic Hollywood like stereotype of a Japanese sneaky Japanese guy. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So,
Yeah,
uh,
he definitely had a presence
yeah, he
about
was
him just by coming out that not very many other people could have.
the guy could smile and get heat. I mean, how? Like that doesn't happen even today.
Yeah.
So it's that was something to marvel at. And where he was paired best was with Don Morocco. They had a great pairing together. But and because they played off each other because they were both Hawaiian, in real life, and
Yeah.
uh, they were best friends. So they played off each other really really well, and that was important. Later we talked Kurt Hennig and Bobby Heenan. Later they were playing off each other. That's why I think that teaming worked. Not so much with Kurt and the coach, where
Yeah.
that was weird.
Right.
Like
The coach, he was a wrestler up in Canada, wasn't he?
he wrestled in the States too. He was John Tolos. Uh, he was a wrestler back in the golden era of wrestling and was decent. He was very decent, but he was they had him. They plucked him from Herb Abrams UWF is where they got him from, and he was an interesting promo. But by the time he became a coach, I don't think they hired him for what they were going to hire him for because he didn't say much. He just blew his whistle. So
Yeah,
he was a pre Fonzie before he was there was a Fonzie, right?
yeah. And
So,
like we talked about Kurt Hennig and Bobby Heenan being paired together. That that's just a gold mine that you definitely uh, want to take advantage of. But Hennig and the coach, the coach was really big on interfering in the matches to help Perfect. But aside from that, I don't really know that he served a greater purpose.
no, no, and much like okay, so on the polar opposite end, where you had somebody in a stable, Ravishing Rick Rude, one of the greatest promos, one of the greatest wrestlers ever to grace the ring, right?
Yep.
Why was Bobby Heenan put with him? I don't think it was completely needed for Bobby Heenan to be with him, to be honest. And you notice they're not playing off of each other like Kurt and Bobby were. You know what I mean? Where they were just getting into it. Whereas Rude and Bobby, and then go to find out through Bobby, it was by design because Rude did not want to be upstaged and Bobby took a back seat. So it hindered Bobby, you know?
Yeah.
So Bobby
Well,
was best when he was just being Bobby, and it could be that out there guy, you know?
yeah. Well, and I think the functionality of a manager like that, there's you can create rivalries that seem a lot more uh, organic, and it
Yeah.
was an easy pass to program guys with each other through managers.
Right. And even with going when we talked Jimmy Hart, Jimmy worked best with guys that he could play off of, like see the Hart Foundation early on, you know what I mean? Which were a put together tag team when you think about it, but together all those three made sense, for the
The
purpose
natural
they
disasters too.
yeah, or the Nasty Boys was a big one also.
Yeah, and Tim and I
You,
have noted that Jimmy had matching attire for whatever team he was wrestling and whatever whatever look they had. He would always dress the part. I mean, how many megaphones did he have to carry around to all these different shows?
oh man. But go to find out from most people in the business, Jimmy was a walking gimmick. He was literally just gimmick upon gimmick of things. I heard DDP when he got into the business was that way later, but Jimmy was just a walking talking gimmick. And
Yeah,
I think that's why people believed well, and also what helped Jimmy was his small stature, so everyone believed that they can kick Jimmy's ass. And B, he just was so out there, you know what I mean? But you could tell, my point being, we talked Nasty Boys, we talked like the teams, any team or guy that he was with, the Mountie was a good example too.
yeah,
Anybody he was good at, you could tell the guys he liked managing better than the guys that he was just put with. Does that make sense?
well,
Like
and
because played off him a little differently than like him and the Nasty Boys. I felt played off each other perfect. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Or him and uh um what's his face? Him and the Mountie.
yeah,
So like you could just tell that the certain guys that he was with, he was playing off them perfectly, and then there was other guys where he was just put together with them, and that it was Jimmy Hart, and he's representing this guy. You know,
what do you think of his pairing with the Honky Tonk Man, and then
perfect,
a little bit
perfect.
later on, Rhythm and Blues?
Rhythm and blues, not so much. It that had legs, and it could have been great if Greg was into it. Now, Jimmy and the Honky Tonk Man, perfect. Like both from Memphis, both knew what each other was about, same style, played off each other, just perfect,
Yeah,
perfect, perfect, perfect. Much like Kurt and Bobby, I keep going back to, but it
yeah,
bears repeating. Perfect. You put those two together, it was like they were just you could just tell. That's why it was so good. They were
yeah.
playing off. you know?
Yeah, yeah, they were very similar, similar personalities, just really irritating. I think Jimmy walking around with that megaphone nonstop, people would get so frustrated with him, and him and Honky seemed, it's like they had this obnoxious Memphis guy that was just cranked up to 11 the whole time.
Yeah, and deceptively good in the ring for what he was. You know what I mean? Like, and Honky had no delusions about him being, you know, Carl Gotch as far as being great wrestler, but he was a entertainer, and Jimmy was an entertainer. So of
Yeah,
course that chemistry playing off each other is going to work. You
I
know?
know when I was a kid, Honky was one of the very, very few uh, heels, I guess, that even as a kid, where I was very impressionable to whatever the WWF at this time wanted to send across as like a message on who these guys were and what they wanted to do. He was the obnoxious heel. I still thought Honky was pretty cool, even as a young kid.
And I grew up an Elvis fan through my mom and my grandmother, so I mean I instantly liked him because he was an Elvis impersonator. But when you heard the promo and the shtick and whatever, it's like, oh wow, how can you not like this guy? But he's supposed to be a bad guy. But
Yeah,
you like who you like, and
yeah,
impressionable me, like I had said in previous episodes, him and Arn Anderson were two guys I liked right away that were on the bad side that I couldn't explain why I liked them, but I knew I liked them for some odd reason. Honky
yeah,
may have been a little more obvious because of the Elvis connection, because
yeah,
I to this day I still love Elvis Presley's music, but
yeah,
it's yeah, it's something, it's charisma. It just draws you. You know what I mean?
yeah. And I think another function of managers back then was if you wanted to turn someone heel or turn them face, uh, one of the bigger ones that I remember, barely, but I remember from a kid, uh, was the Powers of Pain were faces, which is kind of
Yep.
odd. And Demolition was being managed by Mr. Fuji. And then you have that match where Fuji turns on Demolition and they become uh, pretty much fan favorite iterations of the Road Warriors. But it was just very functional again for managers to uh, turn guys either heel or babyface.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And it was just again the Powers of Pain were not great talkers by any stretch of the imagination. Fuji wasn't like I explained earlier. He wasn't that fantastic of a promo, but he was enough to where like the face and he could say some things and it can get across as very heelish. You know what I mean? Like that slimy heel kind
Yeah,
of vibe. And putting him with the powers of pain just totally helped them out as far as that went. Um
yeah,
uh well, Powers of Pain, of course, getting to the WWF was a result of them not getting the Road Warriors yet again. You know what I mean? Because that's why Demolition was created. Then they brought in Powers of Pain, which at first they were managed by Baron von Raschke from AWA. Not
oh,
he was just going by the Baron at the time, and he looked like the Emperor from Star Wars basically because he wore a hood with fucking makeup and all that. But yeah, it was, but that didn't work. So they eventually would turn them heel and put them with Fuji, and that totally worked. For that team and for that time, yes.
yeah.
So
I think Fuji was very effective as a heel manager. If he was at ringside, that cane was going to get used pretty
yeah,
much every match.
and I was about to say he added a different dimension to the Powers of Pain, just like previous how he added a different dimension to Demolition. Because if you remember, Demolition managed by Luscious Johnny B at first, kind of goofy promo, like didn't fit with the team really. But then when they put him with Fuji, it was like, ooh, wait a minute. You got these serious dudes in the ring with the slimy manager on the outside of the ring, and
Yeah,
hence they had their reign of terror on the tag belts for well over a year. You know what I mean? held the
Yep.
record. And man, they were one of the teams. I think they turned babyface right in the middle of their tag run, if I'm not mistaken, their title run. Yeah.
I'm
So
trying. It was. I'm trying to remember what event that was.
Survivor
Was
Series '88.
okay.
Yep, that's when they made the big turn because I always found it weird that it was the Powers of Pain at the end with the Conquistadors of all freaking teams, and
Yeah.
it was funny because the commentators were thrashing the Conquistadors the whole match, like, they're not going to last till the end, and then they last till the end, you know?
Yeah. So outside of the WWF at this time, uh, WCW or any much more smaller regional promotions at this time. Uh, let's talk about WCW.
Yeah.
Who were some of the key managers there, and what were uh, some of the more prominent stables that were going on in
Okay.
WCW?
All right. So you can't not mention NWA WCW without mentioning JJ Dillon because he managed the Four Horsemen.
Yeah.
So that, and I mentioned him earlier, and that bears repeating as well.
Was he the
JJ,
first manager of the Horsemen?
yes, only manager of the Horsemen until 1989 or so, early '89. That's when all of a sudden the Horsemen aren't until he had left in November. Um, JJ stuck around with Barry until '89 and early '89, and then they ended up going. So all of a sudden, Flair and Barry, no, it was maybe Barry stuck around a little longer. Yeah, Barry stuck around just a little longer, and then somehow he was in a de facto team with Michael Hayes and Butch Reed, and they were managed by Hiro Masuda for some reason. I don't know why. That was inexplicable, but regardless. But you had JJ there all the way from the glory days of Crockett when they got on in '85 all the way up until '89 time period. Then Cornette comes in. Cornette and the Express come in around late '85. Paul Ellering was there with the Road Warriors. I didn't feel the Road Warriors needed Paul Ellering, quite honestly. That's controversial of a statement for me to make because Paul is considered one of these great managers and he's in the Hall of Fame, but I understand because functionality wise, he really managed the Road Warriors behind the scenes. I had no idea of this when I was a kid. I just thought he was a strange promo with a
Oh,
Wall Street Journal. You know what I mean? But like, because well, think about it. Because Hawk and Animal could talk. Hawk had the off the oddball promo, and Animal was the kick-ass promo, right? Why do
yeah.
you need Paul Ellering with him to do this weird like? And so the hourglass goes, and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, oh, geez.
Yeah, he was
Like,
like the herald of the Road Warriors.
right? Why do you need him? You know, but I didn't know at the time he was managing their businesses backstage. Cornette was big then, you know, managing the Midnight Express. Like I said, they came in in '85. Uh, uh, then you had later you had Paul Heyman come in as Paulie Dangerously. That was in the late '80s, '88 time period, and Paul was put with a lot of teams. He first managed the original Midnight Express, then he was put with the Samoan SWAT team. So, and that ties into today where he's managing Roman Reigns and the Bloodline because, you know, he was managing Samu, Fatu, and Tonga Kid, who are all relatives of
Yeah.
that bloodline. So, to me, when they stuck him with Roman, that made perfect sense if you do your wrestling history. So,
Well, and Paul definitely today, I mean, he is the guy for stables, advocates, managers. Those things have really kind of faded out of the main wrestling scene, but
that
he
that
has
comes
adapted.
that comes down to the talent of his promos. You cannot beat Paul when it comes to the promo. Now, thankfully, MVP has come into prominence as his own guy as
Yeah,
far as being the manager. Also, great fit, you know, because Bobby can talk and he's getting better, but he's not by much. He needs an MVP to talk for him. You know what I
yeah.
mean?
Well, and
Let Bobby be the ass kicker. Let MVP be the shit talker. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Let,
and I
let
think Well, and I think MVP turning on Bobby and now managing Omos is
Yes.
only going to do great things for Omos because he is. I mean, he's a presence himself. Um,
And yes, we mentioned it on the Big Man episode, and yeah, he. I think down the line, it may not be tomorrow, it may not be next week, but down the line, Omos is going to be big star, and I think just him being thrown with MVP, that's gonna speed along the process just a little bit. You know what I mean? Because he needs
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he definitely has talent and potential. Um, but having MVP there to, for at least the time being right now, uh, kind of balance out his, he's still a little bit green. But I absolutely believe that he's going to be the next dominant big man for the next decade, in my opinion.
And he certainly meets the criteria for all the qualifications that I mean any wrestling promoter would look for. Never mind Vince McMahon, but
Yeah.
he whatever it is, he meets it, and he's going to be. I
Yeah.
mean, give it time. Give it time.
So jumping back to WCW,
Yep.
NWA.
Yep.
Uh, I definitely feel that uh, the premier stable out of this time period was definitely the Four Horsemen.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
what what is their origin story?
Origin story is well, Tully was the first guy to be managed by JJ, right? It was just basically that package was it was those two, and that came as a result of Tully being managed by Baby Doll, and basically turning on Baby Doll. Baby Doll turns babyface and starts managing Dusty and Magnum and all those guys. Um, and that added more of a heelish element to Tully that people believe, like where he can just be this rotten bad guy, and they put JJ with him because Tully was an interesting promo, but he wasn't JJ as far as promos went. So they played off each other pretty darn well. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
because they were friends in real life. So that's how that started. Then Arn comes into the picture, and Arn and Tully cross paths, team up, and then that's how de facto he became that manager. Then all of a sudden you have to condense television time, you have the Four Horsemen. You have everyone had so Ole, Rick, Arn, and Tully all had programs going with Dusty and Magnum and all the revolving talent on the babyface side, maybe the Road Warriors, maybe Rock and Roll, and really insert whatever teams here. And so it just so happens that they were all shooting a promo one day together, and Arn comes up with the catchphrase, not since the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse has such terror. Right? Tony Schiavone hears it, tells Arn it's cool, go with it, and then next thing you know, there's a Four Horsemen right there, and it was all as a result of a localized regional promo for a show where all of them were on there with JJ because JJ was the manager,
yeah,
of Tully, so he had to be there. So that look, basically, and it was an organic creation. It was not an office creation.
yeah,
So, uh,
and it
and
definitely
and that
worked.
makes oh yeah, and it makes me wonder, if Crockett really put his stock behind the Four Horsemen and really marketed it hard. He did later, but it was too little, too late. But if he had done it right from the beginning, whew, man, the business. You know what I mean? Because you always had a stable of four guys that were going to go after Dusty and Magnum, and that main event just could have kept going and going and going and making them money.
Yeah.
So
Um, when did the Four Horsemen first see a shakeup in the lineup where there was some Civil War things going on in there and people leaving and being brought in? When did we start to see that?
87, probably towards mid. mid to late '87, you had Ole was legitimately retiring from pro wrestling, or phasing his career down a little bit. You know what I mean? Ole was older than everyone at that point and established himself. Uh, they bring in Lex Luger, who Lex Luger probably a year and a half, 2 years in the bit. No, not even 2 years in the business. He's probably like a year and a half into the business. They bring him in as basically a horseman protege. You know what I mean? Like they were going to groom him to be the next guy, and why not? Here you go. You have this powerful looking guy who can compete with your Road Warriors or your Magnums or your, by that time, Nikita Koloffs of the world that were humongous. Horsemen bring in this big heater who necessarily isn't the greatest wrestler in the ring, and everyone knows it. Not the greatest promo either. Hence, they need JJ there. So, but you have a heater guy, much like an Omos we are talking about, right? Where you bring in this big green guy that you know is going to be talented, but you don't know when, So you have that happening. So you have a little mini feuds going between Ole and Lex, because Lex wants the spot. Ole's not completely ready to give it up yet, even though he's going home. So you have that natural civil war there. And then,
Yeah.
of course, Lex gets into the rest of the horsemen's ear saying, oh, well, Ole's going off. He's going to go watch his son wrestle. He has no time for the horsemen. He has no time for you, yada, 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 yada. And then that whole, the combustion builds and it explodes from there. So,
Yeah. Like I was not watching WCW at this time. I didn't even know that it existed. But how how impactful was the first little civil war and breakup of the Four Horsemen to the product and to the business at this time?
it was impactful in a way that, okay, so when Ole leaves and Lex replaces, now you have your core element. You have Arn, Ole, and Rick being the core guys. And you always had that one rotating horseman member where the guy that rotated out. So Ole leaves, not a big deal. You know what I mean? Kind of not a big deal. So you have Luger come in at replacing that spot. Well, everyone knew that Luger was inexperienced and not quite ready yet for prime time, but they were getting him ready for prime time. But at the same time, how can the horseman not be jealous of a guy? That will cause resentment where you're jealous of a guy who, here's this guy, he's less than 2 years in the business. All of a sudden, he's in main events,
Yeah.
get main event money. Why can't no? Let's pull this sucker back a little bit. You got to humble. So you have this built-in storyline going to where you knew Lex wasn't going to be in there very long, and they kick him out, and of course he works with Rick and makes the money. You know what I mean? Chasing Ric Flair for the title, which that always worked better than Lex actually winning it, to be honest. So you had Lex chasing the belt, and then that opened the door for Barry Windham to come in, who was still young, still lean. But Barry, unlike Lex, had years of experience, can work with a paper bag, and
Yeah.
just it added a different element to the Horseman. Where with Barry, maybe he can go off on his own, and we've seen him do it with Flair, but Barry was so good that how can you break up that chemistry? You might want to keep it, and they did until the Horseman left in late '88, early '89. So
Well, and Barry Windham was just reliable, consistent,
yep.
and uh, even from like a kayfabe point of view, I think just adds uh, stability to
I,
the Horseman.
I think they wanted to do that same formula with Barry so he could break off and work with like Rick or any of those guys. But Barry was so good at being a heel, it was like, how can you break him up? You know what I mean? Because that group was so good. You put it in the context of 80, 87, no, 88, 89 time period was when that all happened. Barry was one of the best in the world. So, and you add that with Rick being on top of his game. Arn and Tully being on top of their game in the tag division. Then you have Barry, who's a United States champion. You have JJ managing, and JJ was important to Barry because Barry was okay, but JJ added for the promo. So and they worked off each other well. So you had things going for it that you really didn't want to break that up. But you know, I think
At,
initially they wanted that chemistry. This is just supposing and surmising, but I don't think it worked that way. Not the way it did with Lex.
yeah, were they using the Four Horsemen to start to make these guys into bigger stars than maybe they could have done on their own? Was there a long-term planning like that?
I don't think there was. I think they were just kind of doing it as they went along. I think as history would show, it became that way. You know what I mean? Not so much with Ole, but definitely with Lex and Barry. That they tried making. Well, I would say more so with Lex. They made it that way. You know what I mean? So
Okay.
it certainly worked for Lex. He got that big guaranteed contract out of it. So, which upset everyone in the locker room, that he got it. And,
Yeah.
him and the Road Warriors, they were the first to get those guaranteed. And then Midnight got the guarantee. And then Arn and Tully went for the guarantee and not so much. So, company's in trouble. We can't pay you.
All right. So, uh, getting into the very, very late 80s and the early 90s, uh, who are some of the more well-known managers in WCW?
Okay, so in the early '90s, you had now a guy that his name doesn't really come up, but however, he worked for both WWF and WCW at one point. NWA was Oliver Humperdinck come up, and he would manage like different guys. Like he managed the Samoan SWAT team for a little bit, and then he managed after Paulie, and then he managed the Freebirds for a piece. Bam Bam Bigelow when he was in and out there for a piece.
Yeah.
Also, continuing on from his WWF days, you had him. You had Teddy Long came into the picture. Teddy Long started as a ref for NWA, and then he transitioned into a manager, very similar to what he did in WWE later. So, Teddy became very successful. Uh, Diamond
Huh.
Dallas Diamond Dallas Page, one of the tallest managers ever, but they bring him in. He's a third string commentator, but he's also managing the Freebirds. He's managing Diamond Stud. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Uh, as well in the Freebirds, he was more of a hanger-oner to Humperdinck at first. Um, I think it's when he started managing Scott Hall as the Diamond Stud was when DDP became DDP, but that didn't last very long. He became a wrestler from there on out, and the rest is history. Um, Trying to think of what else. Paul Heyman comes back into the fold for a little while. You had Medusa come in. Uh, they more made her into a manager, but Paul and Medusa was more of a hanger-oner to Paul, but in the Dangerous Alliance. Um, Kevin Sullivan even became a manager for a piece, managing the One Man Gang. So
Yeah.
it's when they brought him back in the early '90s. So it, managers. It wasn't like how it was in the WWF, where managers were very few and far between in WCW. But the ones that they had were okay. WWF, of course, just had them lock, stock, and barrel and that went for like you had Jimmy was, I mean, by the end of his run, he was managing Hulk Hogan.
Yeah.
Which talk about not needed. You know what I mean? Like, I sure it added some flashiness to Hulk, and of course it's similar to Paul Ellering. Same thing. Jimmy was Hulk's real manager in real life, so business manager. So that's why Jimmy was brought into the fold. So that's why that pairing didn't make any sense really to the untrained eye. Uh, then you had oh gosh, you have Paul Bear, probably one of the greatest managers of all time because he managed one of the greatest gimmicks of all time, an Undertaker.
Yeah.
So, but Paul never strayed. He always just managed one guy. He wasn't a stable guy. He was a stable guy when he was in World Class, but he was not a stable guy when he got into the WWF. He didn't need to be.
Well,
Undertaker was polarizing enough to not be, and you needed Paul Bear because you needed Undertaker had a couple good words, but you have Paul Bear leading the promos.
well, and I think a big part of Taker's uh, character was that he is a man of few words.
Right, and and that's what kept him strong for all those years. That mystery, you know.
Yeah, and when I went over Royal Rumble 1994 with Tim, um, the preparation for the double wide, double deep casket for Yokozuna and the little vignette where Undertaker goes ho 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 was easily my favorite moment of that whole event. Uh, I know that's a little sidetrack, but
Oh, and how can I forget Miss Elizabeth and Sensational Sherry?
I was just about to start
Right?
asking you about there where you have valets, but around this time it's true that you did start to see female managers start to pop up.
Yeah, yeah. So started with Elizabeth, of course, because as I mentioned earlier, I totally digressed from that conversation. But when they were all the managers were recruiting Macho Man when they came in, right? And he brings out Miss Elizabeth, his real wife, which go to find out that was actually supposed to be Precious from the World Class Championship Wrestling, who Precious managed gorgeous Jimmy Garvin among others, Chris Adams, all that stuff. But Mach wanted his real life wife, so hence Elizabeth got in, and you had her for many years, but she was more she said her. I mean, again, I don't think Savage needed her, but it added an element to Savage, and it's a weird kind of chemistry that hasn't happened before or since with a husband and wife team. You know what I mean? But they didn't lead on that they were married back
Yeah, their match made in heaven
then. Yeah,
was
yeah.
art
But
imitating life.
Elizabeth said very few words, never got touched really. So it's as far as getting involved. But when Sherry came in, that was a completely different story. Again, she was a trained wrestler, so she knew how to not only dish it out but also take it. So
Yeah,
it,
she could take it, but she also had a lot of experience on the stick and working pretty involved with the business as well.
yeah, yeah, because she was a great heel promo on her own, and then you stick her with Savage, which she can play and that was again, you could tell that was a real thing because they played off of each other's craziness very, very, very well.
Yeah,
So you had that. Virgil comes to mind, even. Uh,
yeah,
Uniquely, he manages, he was the slave, the bodyguard, or whatever. You can't really use slave now. It's politically incorrect. But Million Dollar Man did call him his personal bodyguard slash servant slash slave. So I don't know.
yeah.
That's
I
all.
mean, yeah, but I think that was hinting at something maybe a little bit more less obvious than what those words kind of mean today.
It
But
doesn't age well, is what I'm saying. It just doesn't age well.
yeah, definitely.
but yeah, valets. Sherry, of course, does her thing, and then of course she goes on and manages Ted DiBiase, different type of charisma there, and then you had
That always
Sean.
kind of befuddled me. I don't like. I think Sherry is my probably all-time favorite female wrestler, female character in the business, and everything she did, I believe, was great. But her with Ted, it didn't land well for me. I don't know. I don't think it was bad, but
No, but it wasn't okay. So it wasn't her and Shawn Michaels, which would come later in the year. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Where that had more of a chemistry. Her and Ted were kind of. I just feel like they were kind of put together just to be put together because think about it. DiBiase loses Virgil because Virgil becomes a full time wrestler. Savage goes back with Elizabeth, so it's like they were basically just left afloat doing nothing, and I think
and
they just got together.
Yeah, and there are lots of instances throughout wrestling history where little random things like that have turned out to be uh, uh, pretty big deals afterwards. The later on the New Age Outlaws, they did pretty good for themselves. But
Oh, I
yeah, but yeah, I was always a little befuddled by just that one pairing.
but then flash forward, because Sherry phases out around '93 from WWF, makes her transition into WCW in '94. Then you have Tammy Sitch, Sunny, who's now recently made headlines for the wrong reasons, but
Yeah,
you had back then. She comes in '95. She manages Candido, and it was Skip and Sunny, and of course they worked off each other well because they were together in real life. So it's then you had her come in, and then they did the gimmick where she had all the tag team champions and all that stuff.
yeah.
So, but
Her and LOD was
yeah, that was more. That was more. She kind of got lost in the shuffle by that point, and because Sable had totally, like we had just mentioned in a previous episode, had eclipsed her by
a lot.
by a mile by that time. So, and Sonny was kind of left holding the bag with nothing to do. So, hey, and the Road Warriors were stale at the time. I'm doing the air quotes. So, hey, let's put these two together, and it didn't work. So,
Yeah. We're getting kind of close to the NWO, which I think maybe is the faction or stable to end all factions or stables. But um, before we start to see that, you had mentioned that Sunny is getting paired sometimes randomly with people just to kind of see uh, what sticks. Um, Jumping back over to WCW at this time,
yeah.
who do we see there, and who are some of the more prominent stables that have been put together?
Well, the first one I could think of off the top of my head is Colonel Parker and his stud stable, which was actually called the stable. Uh, had Bunkhouse Bunk in it, had Dirty Dick Slater at one point, it had Terry Funk was in it at one point. You had all these different. Austin was in it at one point. Young, stunning Steve Austin was in it. So Colonel was doing his thing, but he was more. That was I like Robert Fuller, but he was very that was just a bizarre man. Like he to me, he always reminded me of the Colonel from Colonel Sanders, like the KFC
Yeah,
guy. Like I never I found it hard to take him seriously. Now I take him more seriously knowing the history of what he was in the business. I just didn't take him seriously then. You know what I mean? In that point in the '90s, no. But he was there. Teddy Long kind of was still managing, but kind of was with guys that kind of went nowhere, like Ice Train, like Jim Powers, mysteriously in 1996. Craig Pittman was another one he managed. Yeah, so these names do
yeah,
nothing. Jimmy Hart, well, he's still managing Hulk Hogan, but then they break him off, and then all of a sudden he's a heel again, managing the Dungeon of Doom, which
yeah,
uh, I guess was good for them. But by 1995, that style of being a manager had played itself out a little bit. You know what I mean? Like Dungeon of Doom was not good. you know,
no,
not good, no matter how you slice it. I mean, good wrestlers in the stable, just not
sure.
good. Not good chemistry wise and context and
Promo wise, even then,
yeah, no,
you
it
can have
just
some guys that are pretty competent, but the the gimmick, I guess, of the Dungeon of Doom that was a big miss for me.
yeah, and Jimmy being involved with that only brought Jimmy's level down just a little bit. You know what I mean? I didn't really. It, I mean, it was all a vehicle for Hulk Hogan to work with people, but at the same time, it was like, why in 1995? You know what I mean? Or Jimmy managing the Renegade. Remember the Renegade?
Yeah,
So
that's
Jimmy managing that was a miss. I think Jimmy's. I'm not going to say his whole run in WCW was a miss. I just think he wasn't utilized to the best of his capabilities there, like he was in WWF, as far as like the managerial side went. But that a lot of that had to do with the times changing and that time not being
yeah,
on Jimmy's side. You know what I mean? So it was natural that he went behind the scenes and did a lot of production stuff backstage and a lot of music for the guys backstage.
yeah.
Even some of that didn't land. I mean, come on, the American males. That
Ah,
theme, I mean,
I mean,
man,
that's like the
it's
what
funny
does the
for all the
fox
wrong
say of
reasons.
wrestling themes?
It's funny for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
Memorable
So
too.
yeah, for me talking about this transitional time of the business, I think in WCW I was definitely thinking about the Dungeon of Doom. Um, some of the, eh, I don't know, the what was it? The White Castle of Fear.
Oh, that was before the Dungeon of Doom. That was
that
Vader actually.
that wasn't the Dungeon of Doom.
No,
Oh,
that was the lead up to Super Brawl 3. That was Vader challenging Sting to come to the White Castle of Fear. They did a big like skit
I
about
know.
it, and Sting shows up via helicopter there, and Harley's there in this bar with Vader and the little person that was in the Beach Blast promo. No, the Beach Blast thing came after. The little guy was in the spin the wheel, make the deal
Oh
thing
yeah,
prior with that was the Jake the Snake one.
yeah.
Ironically enough, R as well. So it's
Well, and when uh, Tugboat had his very spectacular debut. That was for the Dungeon of Doom, wasn't it?
nope. That was a Clash of Champions in '93. That was they brought him in. They meaning uh, uh, that was the Dusty Rhodes regime. They brought him in to be part of the first Fall Brawl, which was the renamed War Games. Basically, it was the War Games match, but they renamed the pay per view Fall Brawl, and they brought him in as a mystery partner for Sting and the British Bulldog that team, and that's when that spectacular fail happened. I gotta say though, Fred Ottman, the guy who plays Shockmaster slash Typhoon, man, has he capitalized on that so much. I mean, he probably makes more money off that now than he ever did during that whole Shockmaster run.
Yeah.
And
I don't know.
I'm sure he got a good guarantee because I mean, of course, he's Dusty's. I think he's Dusty's brother-in-law, if I'm not mistaken. So, or he
Oh.
was, and yeah. So, uh, yeah. So, I,
What,
I
so
can only
for
I can only imagine he's gotten the last laugh. So,
yeah, I know he still does conventions, and uh, and things like that. He's had a lot of longevity in the business.
yeah, and like I said, that's a positive. That's a negative turned into a positive right there, and him making the most out of the very least. So.
Yeah. So when if we take a look at WWF, um, the last I think faction or stable of this transitional time, going into a different era. Um, I think of the Million Dollar Corporation, where a lot of guys who didn't have eh, much to do got put in there. Um, and there was a lot of instances that I think where you had, rivalries and uh, championships and everything. And over in WCW, I take a look at again the Dungeon of Doom, kind of uh, the last two stables in both promotions before we start to go into the Attitude Era, the NWO era.
Yes. You had okay, but where the Million Dollar Corporation did it correct was they actually members were involved in feuds with top names, and actually the storylines made a little sense. The biggest one being the biggest glaring one, in my opinion, was when they turned Tatanka heel against Lex,
Yeah,
which that was a well done storyline, and that actually did make money, and did create some interest. Um, that was early on in the Million Dollar Corporation. Later, when it became like, okay, we're going to throw Sid in here, we're going to throw Kama in here, we're going to throw King Kong Bundy from fucking out of nowhere in here, then that became whatever, But and I think Bam Bam, of course, Bam Bam was in it because the Lawrence Taylor match that leads up to Bam Bam returning into a babyface again after,
yeah,
because the Dollar Man was embarrassed about the loss to a football player and yada yada. So kind of was like its last legs kind of deal, and then it became where the Million Dollar Corporation kind of wound down, and it had like three members in it at one point, where it was like 1, 2, 3 Kid turning heel, um, Sid and Tatanka, which by that time, and then of course he goes on and manages the Ringmaster, and then it kind of was like
yeah,
he solely managed Steve Austin after that, but really the Million Dollar Corporation had its big run, I would say like 94, early 95 time period.
yeah.
Um, you know what
And
I mean?
and
But it, but
DiBiase is definitely a success story of uh, starting off as a wrestler, maintaining relevancy, and then bringing back the $1 million championship and getting Steve for whatever time they did have together. That's historically significant
yeah,
anyway for what he would go on to do.
whether it's good reasons or bad reasons, because according to Austin, he didn't want to be put with DiBiase because he felt he could talk, but Vince felt he couldn't talk at the same time, liked him more for his ring work than his promos. Clearly, Vince didn't watch the ECW stuff,
Yeah,
where but anywho, uh, Austin was able to make the best out of that, and of course, he only was the biggest draw in the '90s, so I think it worked for him. But
yeah. And so, what was the what was going on in the Dungeon of Doom in their dying days right now?
okay, so Dying Days, you had Giant, who is still in it, Big Show, and Kevin Sullivan were like the guys, maybe the Faces of Fear, but they would break off on their own and become their own little tag team. Faces of Fear being Barbarian and Meng. And then they just became another tag team. Giant was still being managed by Jimmy Hart for a time. Also, Kevin Sullivan was probably the last, and he was the de facto leader of the Dungeon of Doom anyway. So of
Yeah,
course he was going to be last. But Kevin retires and goes off screen, and then Jimmy goes off screen, and comes back once in a while. So you had it kind of what fizzled out and kind of faded away. It really faded away with no real pomp and circumstance. Some would say the Million Dollar Corporation did too, but I would have to venture to say DiBiase's Million Dollar Corporation served more of a purpose than the Dungeon of Doom ever did. You know what I
yeah,
mean? It may have been a vehicle just for Sullivan himself, or I mean, just to get Big Show established, as being a top guy, but he didn't. But Big Show, in my opinion, didn't need it because he was already established as a top guy anyway, just working with Hogan,
yep,
So, and whether or not he was going to be established going forward was on. I mean, it all came down to Big Show because I mean, Christ, big, charismatic. He was in shape. He was going to be a star regardless of
yeah,
what group he landed in. So really, him being in the Dungeon of Doom, I felt was irrelevant. So
yeah. Because he definitely had the look, he had the presence uh, that came with him down to the ring, and if he could string more than three words together, he was going to get over, and he was a very competent guy in the mic.
right, yes, he was. Mm-hmm.
All right, so now in the WWF, we're in the new generation era. Uh, Nitro is relatively new. I mean, Nitro was around for about 6 months before Scott Hall shows up. How long?
Yep. Yep,
Yeah.
that's about right. It debuts in September '95. He comes in May of '96. So
Okay.
yeah, about 6 months or so.
Yeah. And then the the wrestling business is about to change quite a bit, and we're gonna have another invasion angle, um, but on a very different uh, a different platform than I think they've done before. Um, we have Scott Hall, and then Kevin Nash, and uh, walk us through the formation of at least the first iteration of the NWO. Uh, who was joining from where? Uh, uh, Set us up for the New World Order.
Okay, so by all accounts, it all stems back to early 1996 when Scott Hall gives his notice first. Then Kevin Nash gives his notice shortly after Scott Hall. Uh, so you have those two guys, they're going to WCW. What they're stepping into, they don't know. Nobody knows because while Bischoff may have had this plan Rolodexed in the back of his head for this invasion angle, I mean, who is he going to pull that off with, really? Um, uh, they tried it early in late 95. They tried it with the New Japan faction. Of course, that worked some, but it didn't really hit like people expected it. So they tried that combination with they were tiptoeing their toe in the water with Hogan turning heel by Hogan, basically wearing all black and all that stuff. So he wasn't a bad guy, but he was all of a sudden Hulk Hogan with an edge, right? So
Yeah,
they put all these seeds in place, whether they knew it or not, in late '95. Fast forward, they get when they finally figure out that Hall and Nash are on their way, right? Then all of a sudden they get in there. Hall and Nash, I don't think they knew what they were getting into. They were just, hey, we're going to go there for the guaranteed money. We don't give a fuck, because we have less dates and guaranteed money.
a lot less
Bishop,
dates.
right? And so Bischoff, I'm sure this may all lie down to Bischoff, to be honest, because if he had this idea formulating in his head and he already kind of sort of sowed the seeds, who knows how early he was planning this? You know what I mean? I just think it was a lot of it was perfect timing because Hall shows up, then Nash shows up a week later. And like they show up. Hogan is gone at this point. Hogan used to do a thing where he would take like the NBA playoffs off like every year, and he would he would be on TV a lot, and then basically claim he was the reason for the high ratings. So hence, whenever contract negotiations would come up, but now it worked to his disadvantage because here's Hall and Nash making a splash without Hogan, right? Because he was gone for a significant period of time out filming a movie. So when Hogan saw that gravy train, they're like, nope. Like Hogan's smart, so he figured the time was then to turn bad. The time was not. It was not his time to turn in '95, but '96 came. He saw the changing of the guard because Hogan's smart.
Yeah,
Therefore, he wanted to align with those two guys. Now, that could have blown up into all their faces by all accounts. You know what I mean? Because Hall and Nash were a different promo style than Hulk, different work rate style than Hulk, uh, just different than Hulk. You know,
yeah,
it it couldn't have worked, but the opposite happened where it worked because factor to stay relevant. And on the other side, you had Hogan teaching these guys how to be big draws. So they synergy. They worked.
yeah.
Perfect. And I think, and a lot of people might agree, some would disagree, but I think if they had kept it those three guys, it might have still have had some legs, much like how the Four Horsemen were with, like, say, Ole in the mix or Barry in the mix. You know, because nothing, they had different groups of the Four Horsemen through the years, but nothing really stuck like those two groups. And I think Ole gets mentioned because he's like, he was the original member. So, you know, of course he has to be mentioned. Personally, I think the Barry group was better, but ring wise and, you know, charisma wise. But I think had they stayed with those three guys, Hogan, Hall, Nash, that would have been perfect. Maybe gave him a manager. That, I mean, DiBiase creeps his way in again. He, you know, which is very believable because you know he was the $1 million man, so they started calling him Billionaire Ted in WCW,
He's
right?
the bank.
Right. Play off of his character in WWF, so that's perfect, right? And by that point, he wasn't about to step back into the ring anytime soon. He was
Yeah.
long far done. So, but when they brought Bischoff into the mix as the evil heel owner, corrupt guy, that added a different mix to those guys because Bischoff, a lot like Jimmy Hart, had that heat where you wanted to punch him.
Yeah.
But
Very
and
effective.
and he was great. He was quick. He was Bischoff totally filled the part. So I think if you had those core three guys and maybe Bischoff, maybe DiBiase in the mix, I think it would have been fine. But adding more members as time went on, which that did not benefit them. Past
Not in the
like
long run, no.
no, maybe like past maybe like if they had stopped with maybe X Pac, they probably would have been fine. But they just kept adding and adding and adding, as you know, and then all of a sudden, you know, they break off, and then there's a red and black, and then there's a black and white, and then
Yeah,
you know,
anybody that had a name for themselves in the WWF was packaged in with the NWO. So let me ask you this:
yep,
they were not the first guys to play up an invasion angle. Um, I think that being as edgy as they were, and even Scott Hall's work as Razor Ramon was one of the, uh, I mean, pioneers of like an anti-hero, you know, a really edgy uh, kind of guy in a uh, black and white phase of wrestling.
yep.
Does the NWO go on to do what it does without Hulk Hogan, or was Hulk Hogan the reason it became what it did?
I think Hulk Hogan's the reason because you needed what again? What bigger name to be the leader of this group than Hulk because he had been in WWF before. He was the biggest invader of WCW. Think about it. Even before that, he comes in, he gets this large contract and all that stuff with all the, uh, which fans didn't know, but still, it cost a pretty penny and a lot of resources to get Hulk over. And then when he gets over, WCW completely changes, if you notice. Then
Yeah,
all of a sudden it became from the Austins and the Johnny B. Bads of the world to Hacksaw Jim Duggins to Honky comes in for a piece. Earthquake comes in. You know what I mean? Like there's an
Kurt
influx.
Hennig.
Yeah, there's an influx of WWF guys that come in, and like you had these guys. It felt like anybody watching that when Hulk, it was pre Hulk and post Hulk, right? And you could tell the difference. So fans already had a reason to hate Hulk. They just really needed a reason. So by 1996, that was perfect.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I
yeah,
mean, turning Hogan heel after the whole golden era that you know he really was popular. Like without Hulk, I don't think you have that either. And so the business starts to change. Um, what what's up is down. Hogan is the heel, and the NWO uh, starts, I think, ushering in a new era of wrestling. And then uh, up north, we see Bret Hart getting ready to leave the company, the famous Montreal screw job.
yeah,
Um, uh, the WWF does start this faction warfare, like Survivor Series uh, 97 was like faction warfare. You have Las Boricuas, Disciples of Apocalypse. Um, what's going on at the same time, 96, 97 in the WWF running parallel to the NWO in WCW?
So not very many managers left. You have Sunny. They're trying to do things with her where they put her with Farouk for a piece that doesn't work out. Factions, you have your Nation of Dominations, which gets formed, later in the year, where Farouk does a complete 180 with his gimmick and becomes a black militant character, along with, and then they bring in different guys in the group, Savio Vega Crush, which made no sense, but at the same time, they break off and they form Los Barricos, they form POA later, right? So it was a vehicle for them to kind of get established and break off. Sunny's there, but they're kind of winding out because she's kind of veering more in the broadcasting world than she is in the manager world. Cornette is there, same thing. He's phasing out, but he's more doing a backstage role and then later planting the seeds for the OVW thing. So Cornette's kind of phasing himself out. He manages Camp Cornette. You got Clarence Mason there, which Clarence was, well, he started as Cornette's lawyer, and then all of a sudden he becomes a manager, and then
Johnny
all of a,
Cochran in the ring.
yeah, yeah, and then all of a sudden he becomes completely irrelevant and kind of a answer to a trivia question. But he, not to disparage him, I'm just saying that's what happened.
Yeah.
So Paul Bear's still there, but at this point he's managing Mankind now against Undertaker, and he's managing Kane comes in '97, working against Undertaker. So he's managing guys, and then Vader he managed for a brief piece after Cornette goes behind the scenes. So you have uh, managers are becoming very few and far between.
Yeah.
Groups now in the WWF, I would have to venture to say that when the Heart Foundation group comes out, that's a great heel stable until Degeneration X comes out, and then because of course they're needling networks and needling the promotion, and they're edgy and all that stuff. So not since the original iteration of the NWO have you not seen that edginess,
Yeah.
So Sean Hunter, China, and then you add Rick Rude into the mix. You have these guys that are together, and they just eclipse everything that's on TV because they're allowed to be sophomorish.
Yeah.
Whereas the Hart Foundation were more serious, and then the screw job happens, of course, so all the members basically leave except Owen Hart. You
Yeah.
had DX going strong until '98, and then Sean gets laid up, and then they form another version of DX where the Outlaws come in. Triple H is the leader. X Pac from the NWO is back into the WWF. China is the manager, and
That's
that
the for
that
me.
was that was the premier DX team as far as
Yeah.
money making team. You know what I mean? That team made money, but they made money in the sense that it was the Attitude Era, so everyone was making money. But that's the one that gets most associated with.
Yeah. That's the definitive version of the Generation X for my own personal taste.
Yeah, I
Uh,
like the original group because of their innovation, but
yeah.
I understand that they weren't the ones. That version of DX did not make the money that the '98 one did. That
Yeah.
that that'd be my point. You know what I
Well,
mean?
and
Like,
and that's the thing. Even though they were a group, Sean Hunter, China, Rude, um, they were a group, but they weren't really a faction or a stable in the traditional sense that you would think of. Even before Brett left, it wasn't like there's these two factions at each other's throats. You had Brett and Sean, but the other members weren't tied in with each other. If anything, uh, Calgary Stampede, Team USA and Team Canada had more of a rivalry than the Shawn Michaels DX and the Hart Foundation. So it's a very interesting package that
Yeah.
gets put out and broadcasted.
Yeah, because not before or since have they had that strong of a hatred between Canada and the United States in pro wrestling like
Yeah,
that. And a lot of that had to do with the Hart Foundation being such good heels, So especially around 1997, that time period, Brett was probably, I would have to say, promo wise, and Brett was an okay promo. I always felt Brett's promo was best for Brett, but I felt by 97 he was on firing on all cylinders, cutting promos. Then he was great. He was
yeah,
where he was where he needed to be in 1997, in my opinion, and that was probably his greatest run. As Bret the Hitman Hart, when he decided to turn heel after WrestleMania, going forward, that Bret Hart, I wish that Bret Hart stood in the Attitude Era, to be
yeah,
honest.
yep.
So, because he toe to toe, promo wise, everything, he could have held his own bargain against anybody.
I
So,
can, yeah. I mean, I'm obviously a mark for Brett, but I completely agree. Just the taking the reins off and just letting it go. It was so, and it was weird seeing him wrestle in the United States. Uh, Very obviously not very popular. But then the next week, if they're in Montreal or Toronto, holy cow, is the roof being blown off by those fans? Um, and
but again,
that's a unique way for a guy to be on TV like that.
yeah, and to interject too, Brett, it's not like he was wrong in the shit he was saying in his promos. It was the fact that he was right, and the American fans fucking hated him so much for being right that, you know what I mean? Like they
Yeah,
booed him more. It's so, you can't buy something like that, and I don't think it's been done before or since
yeah,
to any level of wellness like that. It's
yeah.
because Brett was still Bret Hart. It was just
The
he was
times had changed and he wasn't going to change with them. He had
and
his values, he knew who he was, and he wasn't just going to roll along with society for
right, and he let you know about it, and that pissed you off, as a fan, or if you hated Bret Hart at the time. But
yeah,
really, he didn't say anything any worse than Sean or Hunter would say in later in the year. In fact, I believe Sean and Hunter went so far with it that that's why that group, in my mind, sticks out as
yeah,
far as innovation.
yeah.
So,
So with by this point, once Brett goes to WCW, um, I think the NWO had started to lose a little bit of its shine. Um, I think the Wolfpack split, and in my personal view, was interesting, but I, I, you're starting to see that this is really a one trick pony, and what was being innovated in the WWF from Steve Austin and Shawn Michaels is going to be the creative future. Um, can you take us through the Wolfpack and NWO Hollywood?
real quick, Wolfpack consisted of probably the coolest members of the NWO. Now, I say cool, all the guys that had the cool factor. You had the core members at its core were Conan, Macho Man, and Nash, who had charisma out the freaking wazoo for their own reasons, right? So, but then you added Sting to the mix, and I never liked that version of Sting, to be honest. And I felt it was just a weird fit for the group. Lex comes in. Lex was never a good promo. He tried being cool, but I think with Lex and Sting, it was more association. They were cool in that group. You know what I mean? The core three members I previously mentioned were really cool and had that charisma. Hall was in it briefly too, but then, of course, Hogan being Hogan and pulling his political strings, he couldn't have Hall being on their side and stealing all the charisma away. So they needed a charismatic guy on the Hollywood side. So that's why Hulk had Hall at the time, on his side more so than the Wolfpack side.
Yeah.
So, but I always felt Hollywood's that version. It was kind of like the rejects. It was like the guys that
Yeah.
weren't so cool. You know what I mean? But Hulk was still the headliner, and he could still do his thing. But it was basically Hulk and like basically his minions. You know, and there was
Horace.
no give. Oh yeah, yeah, bless him. I mean, Horace was great in FMW. Not so much in WCW. That was nepotism 101 right there.
Yeah. All right.
So
So, starting to jump ahead a little bit, faction warfare and the age of the traditional managers and stables uh, has quietly just kind of faded away. And so, uh, going into the ruthless aggression area, WWE absorbs ECW, WCW buys WCW, and absorbs uh, their talent. With the change that the Attitude Era brought to programming, especially when we were just talking about Degeneration X and the Heart Foundation, um, what role do managers have in the ruthless aggression era? Who are they, and um, how are they being used on screen? Have they tried to adapt this role with the times?
no, and that mainly came because Vince didn't like managers. Stables, I'm not sure. It seems like WWE is hot and cool on stables. If you notice, like they'll push them to death, then one day they're gone. Now, as far as managers go, Paul Bear was brought back for a piece when Undertaker re-became the Dead Man after his American Badass run. You also had Paul Heyman in the mix. Now, Paul, they brought him back to manage a young Brock Lesnar. Now, that breaks off. Then he manages Big Show. Then that breaks off. Then he's managing Heidenreich and other guys. Like, basically, just it becomes just place Paul Heyman with anybody. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
You had the cabinet forms with JBL, and there wasn't really I mean, there was a valet, but there wasn't really a manager. You know what I mean? Like it seems like managers have taken a back seat, and there was one point where Paul Heyman was managers of everybody. Like
yeah.
he was it, and he held a stranglehold over it for a lot of years. I would say, and again, you had stables just pop up here, there, everywhere, and it just seemed like they never lasted. For whatever reason, they would get some traction, and then all of a sudden, done. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Just
they weren't part of any long-term programming.
right, right. It was just to fill TV time and to fill space. Um, Paul going in and out of the company at various times or whatever, you know what I mean? But he would always come back and manage Brock Lesnar because that package was there. And again, I mean, he's Brock's real life business manager, yes, but unlike Paul Ellering, unlike Jimmy Hart managing Hulk, Paul and Brock worked off each other very, very, very well. You know what I mean? Because Brock wasn't the greatest promo at the time. That's different now. Brock is great now, as the babyface. But back then, not so much. So you kind of have it kind of fades out a little bit. Doesn't get brought back until I would say it goes away for a long while, and in WWE until like the recent times where finally you're getting MVP in the mix. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And to counter a Paul Heyman, and uh, I know it's only one other guy, but still, like it's
it's
better than what
significant.
it's
Yeah,
better than what we had before because MVP can compete verbally with Paul Heyman. Because he has his own style and his own level. Because he had done it as a wrestler and he was a great promo as a wrestler. So now he can shine the light on other guys. So it's to me, it kind of took. It's kind of similar to the start stop as we talked with the women's titles, right? Where
Yeah,
they start one time, they stop, they start, stop. But it always remained like it would always remain like Fabulous Moolah, for example, or like Paul Heyman's kind of that type, where it was like managerial wise, it's like it always goes back to Paul Heyman for some freaking reason. So
yeah. Like Evolution uh, sticks out to me as a stable. There were definitely some groups. I don't know if they'd really if it's
and
accurate to refer to them as stables. Um, you know,
Evolution is probably the best one to come out of that time period, only because it served its purpose completely. Think about it. Triple H still had his reign of terror, as they like to say. Flair getting another chance to basically make another run, which Flair's done multiple times. Then you had young Randy Orton, younger Batista, you
yeah,
know. So I think he was in his 30s then,
yeah,
uh, 30s. But you had those guys. You knew the group wasn't going to last because you knew Randy and Batista were going to be too good to stay in that one group forever. You knew that that group was going to break up. You just didn't know when, and
yeah,
that's what kept you more tuning in was when. You know,
yeah. I think Evolution was pretty successful. But there are other groups along the way. You brought up Randy Orton. I think of Legacy,
yep.
where you have all these second generation guys, who have the name to them. They're trying to carve out their own spot in the business.
And I thought that was going to serve its purpose too, but DiBiase leaves, DiBiase Jr. that is, and
Yeah,
Cody. Yeah, he breaks off and he does some things, but again, Cody was sadly that was a lot of starting and stopping. As documented in the latest Broken Skull sessions with Austin, where it was a lot of start and stops, and not all negative, but there were things kind of hindering his path to where he wanted to be, and now he's where he needs to be. But
yeah.
back then, not so much.
When I think of uh, what was going on in the business, could you would it be would it be accurate to look to look at the brand split as a modern iteration of faction warfare of stables Raw versus SmackDown?
That was more like promote interpromotional rivalries because WCW and ECW were long gone. So who do you have to compete with? You have each other to compete with, and they
Yeah,
were trying to recreate that, but it didn't work to the. I think it worked some, but it didn't work to the level that they wanted.
yeah.
So
But that's the
and
only thing that pops into my mind, trying to see what was going on in the ruthless aggression era going forward. Um, Managers, like you brought up MVP and Paul Heyman, but the brand
yeah,
split is the only thing I can really kind of put my finger on and say, well, this is kind of like that.
yeah, they were trying to skew it that way to where it was like a rivalry, but everyone knew by that point that WWE owned everything. So it's not it's really not a rivalry. They're competing with themselves.
Yeah.
So
The um, the only other thing that pops out in my mind was uh, the Ministry of Darkness, the corporation, and then the corporate ministry. Um,
oh yeah.
I, I know there's some things in there that definitely were hit and miss, but some things ended up throwing Farouk and Bradshaw together ended up working pretty good. Um,
Uh,
er,
Throwing Edge and Christian in there too helped as
yeah,
well. You
yeah,
know.
and you also have the Brood, that is, I think, being reimagined today with Edge and Judgment Day. Um,
Yep.
what what was the good and bad that came out of these things. Like you said, the brand split was kind of more interpromotional, but um, things with Evolution and NXT, and you have the corporate ministry. For I think for me to kind of round out uh, my thoughts on it, what happened with the Big Boss Man or Boss Man and the Big Show's dad is some of the most hilarious content that has ever been produced in wrestling. But what uh, walk us through the Ministry of Darkness and then the corporate ministry.
All right, so the Ministry of Darkness comes up because uh, Undertaker basically turns heel yet again, uh, realigns himself with Paul Bear, uh, creating that old chemistry again. But he suddenly, one week on Raw, comes out in a cloak and starts sacrificing people on Undertaker crosses, like in the shape of a T. And, I believe the first one was, what was it? It was either Viscera or Midian were like the first one or two. And basically it was just a repackaging of the different characters.
Southern Justice was a great uh, edgy modernizing of the Godwins, I thought.
Yeah, it was, but it didn't work to the extent. And Henry had retired by that or left by that point, and Phineas was still there. So they had to figure out something to do with him, and he's friends with Undertaker, so
Yeah,
why not put him in this group? Viscera, the same thing.
the Acolytes.
Acolytes, well, they were doing nothing with Farouk and Bradshaw at the time, so they repackaged them and as the Acolytes, and that worked. Trying to think of who else was in this group. Edge and Christian came later with Gangrel at first, and then later. Then all of a sudden it becomes the corporate ministry because the corporation forms on this end. You have Test, you have Boss Man, who's part of the group. You have Triple H becomes part of the group at some point. Shane, McMahon, all these guys. So they merge together, and that again, and then Vince is revealed. Oh,
Yeah,
Vince is revealed as the higher power, which that was a whole nother ball of wax. And
yeah,
I heard that was due to the fact that they were going to resign either Jake Roberts or Ultimate Warrior to be in that role. So, which promo wise, if they were going to use them just for promos, that would have been interesting. But
yeah,
of course, because it's Vince, Vince became the higher power. So,
yeah, yeah. That kind of after at that point, there really wasn't much else to do. They had kind of found themselves in an NWO Wolfpack kind of situation where there wasn't much else to do and everybody's involved. So,
yep.
all right. Briefly touch upon what was going on, maybe stable or faction wise in TNA, Ring of Honor. Uh, what were some of the more noteworthy groups throughout this time and the only other promotions?
Okay, so Jared always had a group going. He had a group with America's Most Wanted at one point, where they were running roughshod, and then later um, you had Main Event Mafia, which was a big group in TNA, with all the main event guys. Kurt and Nash, and Steiner and Booker. Sting, I believe, was part of the group. So you had that. You had Abyss was usually part of some sort of dark group. I remember they paired him with Judas Macias at one point, and then they broke off and feuded with each other, where James Mitchell was managing them. you had that. You had trying to think of what else. TNA, they have more. It's weird. TNA had more traditional elements to wrestling to them than WWE did at the time. Like as far as because you had managers there and you had people that were there. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
they had groups, but later they had the Immortal group, which was Hulk Hogan's group, which and then Aces and Eights came out of that, and then yeah, and then you had yeah, it's just they had their own groups, factions, managers, all that stuff. But a lot of
I mean, it
I don't
seemed
know.
like that they were packaged more in an older style.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. The earliest group I can remember was Team Canada, but it did not work to the success that the heel Canadian group did in WWF, which I think is what they were trying to do. And that was
Yeah.
Eric Young, Robert Roode, Scott D'Amore being the flag bearer manager, and all these guys were really Canadian, but it was, and then Petey Williams was the big star because he had the Canadian Destroyer, which first time
Mhm.
we ever saw that in the States. So it's, that was one of the earlier groups I can think of. Jared
Yeah.
always had his groups going with different various members.
Oh yeah, I mean he's always been more of a traditionalist than a uh, trailblazer or trendsetter.
Right, right.
Mhm.
So, yeah, TNA as far as managers go, not very, not too many. I mean, not so much more than WWE, but they had some. They always had signs of life going too, but it was a lot of start stop or a lot of week to week kind of things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, and again, there seemed to be more
ROH.
valets, kind of going back in TNA. There wasn't anything that I saw was really noteworthy or even useful going on.
Yeah, ROH had they had not factions, but like I mean, Bullet Club was part of ROH at one point. Meaning like they would go back and forth between uh here and Japan and stuff like that. But because AJ was in the group at one point, and Bucks and Finn Balor, of course, before he leaves or whatever. So, or maybe not. But okay, so
I mean, these are
uh,
different promotions that are trying to fill a a different void that was left from WWE accumulating all of wrestling, and so their audiences are definitely more of a niche audience.
yeah, yeah. So, I mean, as far as managers go, I mean, maybe just in the early days of Ring of Honor, you had, I mean, shit, there wasn't very many,
Yeah.
uh, to be honest.
Well, and
Uh,
and and these
'Cause it wasn't designed,
organizations
it
as
wasn't
well.
designed that way, I don't think, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. All right. And so taking a look now, we have Paul Lee has always done pretty well with whoever has been stuck with him. I mean, obviously Brock and Roman Reigns are the leaders in that respect.
Mhm.
Um, is there anything or anyone else or anything that sticks out to you that was significant as far as like what managers were doing or what groups were formed that was significant to anybody. Like maybe not necessarily a huge group, but Bradshaw and Farouk being in the ministry was very significant for what they would uh, go on to do as the APA.
Yes.
And in more modern times, do you see anything like that with anybody now or anyone potentially like the Usos being part of the Bloodline. I mean, that was a rebirth of their career.
Yeah, I was about to mention that. And yeah, we had Paul Heyman to thank yet again. Because they're now it's more of a. I mean, that's a cohesive group right there, and that's probably in recent times. I would probably say that there's a reason that group kind of is up here, and everyone else is. Maybe the Hurt Business comes into a close second, but that group, the Bloodline,
Yeah.
right at the top right now. So
I mean, the New Day is more of a. I don't know if they're
they're like a
necessarily a
modern
faction.
Freebirds. They're
Yeah.
they're a modern Freebirds basically because they have three members that are important, but they're also interchangeable at the same time. You
Yeah.
know, and it's been proven and they're very successful at what they do.
Yep.
So
All right. So, wrapping up, who would you say are the most significant managers of all time, and who are your personal favorites throughout all the eras as well?
probably have to go with Bobby Heenan number one. Probably have to go with Cornette number two. Um, uh, just based on managerial styles and their significance to their guys and to the wrestling business. Um, I always loved Jimmy Hart. The way he was. Um, uh, as far as stables go. Um, uh, trying to think of other significance. Probably Paul Heyman. I would
Yeah.
have to put up there. Yeah, just those are the guys I can think of right off the top of my head that
Yeah.
made an impact. And also to throw in the first version of DX, I really really liked for their innovation as well.
Yeah.
So very unlike the money making DX, they were really pushing buttons, and I think that was finally just. Some would say they were just acting out, but I mean, if you look at it from when they started to where the Attitude Era ended up, I mean, Austin being the top guy doing what he did was a
Yeah.
different story, but man, you need a DX to push that envelope so they can get to where they needed to be.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
All right. And if you had to take a look at all throughout all the different eras uh, of wrestling, if you had to pick one instance of somebody either uh, being made from a stable or being made through their manager, um, I don't know if I worded that helpfully or not, but um, what would that be if you had to say, yeah, this person's career was changed uh, for the best because of a stable or a manager, and then they went on to change the business from any era? What would you, off the top of your head, what would you pick?
Uh, who would I pick? I would have to go in recent times with Roman Reigns. I would honestly have to because where he was and where he ends up, where he is now, two different things, and it's only for the better. And I think he's only going to get better. So
Yeah, I know I've been seeing headlines recently about uh, some changes in his contract or deal with WWE, but it's all dirt sheet sites, so I'm not entirely sure what's going on. But because Roman was one of those people who was packaged and crammed down everyone's throat for so long, and they would not take it. There is never a point. I mean, the Rock is in the ring holding up the hand of, from the Roman Empire days of Roman Reigns, and people were not taking it. And then now, and he unified the belts at Mania over Brock Lesnar. That's very significant. And
yeah,
all it took was him stop being crammed down people's throats and given, put with Paul Heyman. And now he's, I mean, the most, I think, influential and biggest thing in wrestling going on right now.
Yes, absolutely. So,
All right. Any closing thoughts?
uh, closing thoughts. Stables when they work well, they work great. When stables are not working well, then you might as well put them out the pasture, because a great stable should at some point serve, and also a great manager should serve its purpose by serving the people involved, clients involved, and making them better, not making them less than, worse than, insignificant than. Uh, it's only when they make them better that they rise above and become very memorable in the pro wrestling. So,
Awesome.
yes.